Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation on growing open source adoption. That's right, we're here to talk to you about how to get people to actually use your open source software, whether that is for just the project's sake or you're trying to make a business or offer some sort of commercial offering around your open source. Open source adoption is critical to getting to that next step. Now, what we want to do is start with some brief introductions and then jump right in because we've got a lot to cover. So, first of all, I am Matt Yonkovit. I am the head of open source strategy, or the HOSS for short. I work at Scarf. I also do quite a few podcasts around the open source space. I've been in the open source industry for over 20 years. I've worked at MySQL AB. I've worked for Percona. I've worked for Mattermost. I've worked for Stream Native. Now I work for Scarf. If you are not familiar with any of these podcasts, I would encourage you to check them out. Always love sharing stories from other founders, maintainers in the space. So check out the Hacking Open Source Business podcast. Happy to have you as a guest. If you are interested in the future, just reach out to me. Now, if you're not familiar with Scarf, Scarf is a set of tools designed to help maintainers and owners track open source adoption and help grow their open source user bases. So if you're interested in that, you might want to give it a check. Would love to have you check it out. But let's get right into driving open source adoption, because that's what we're all here for. We all want to grow open source adoption. We all love this space. Now, I'm going to start off with just a brief overview of what open source adoption looks like and talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges. All right. So this is the open source adoption journey in a nutshell. You could call this a funnel. You could call it a journey. I might use those interchangeably, but just realize when I say those terms, this is what I'm talking about. If you think about your open source project, okay, most people realize, hey, there are potentially millions and millions of users for this project, okay? Developers, engineers, other folks in the space, there's lots and lots of people. Now, when we talk about adoption is really the act of turning those massive amount of people into actual users. And there's a few steps you have to go through, right? So you have these millions of users who are out there who potentially could benefit from your project, from your software, from the product that you're trying to build. They first need to find you and understand what you can offer and understand that you fit what their needs are. Okay? And there will only be a subset of the overall audience and the overall user base that will actually find you and find value in what you potentially can offer. And so you have this kind of like shrinking effect or a funnel effect where you start off with millions and millions of potential users and you might have tens of thousands of people who find your project and go like, ooh, that's kind of interesting. And from there, what you'll have is some subset of those who find it and think, that's interesting, will be motivated enough to actually try out your software. Now, that act of trying out your software or opening up, something in Slack, asking a question, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're users. That is just a interest level that they are potentially interested in using this. And so from there will be some subset of those who try your software who actually become users and rely on your software from a day-to-day perspective. Okay? This funnel is similar to a lot of other product funnels. It's similar to the marketing funnel. It's similar to all of these other things. But the idea is lots of users eventually, or lots of potential users, eventually some of them will become users who rely on your software over the long term. And that's really the goal. Now, when you have users who rely on you, it opens up a lot of opportunities. You get more contributors, right? Contributors come from that user base. You can get potential customers if you are trying to commercialize this. You get potential investment from other companies who are relying on it. Maybe they'll make more donations. Maybe you'll attract, foundation sponsorships. So as we talk about this, realize that there are a lot of potential outcomes from having more users and more adoption of your open source. Whether that's you want more contributors, whether you want, to be, key in a foundation, whether you want to start a business, all of those are potential outcomes. And this open source journey, this adoption, has a few real key things that you need to look for. Now, when I talk about those things, you're going to say, Matt, you are so obvious. I know these things. These are so obvious. Why are you telling me things I already know? Because people get these wrong. All right. And let's start with my Captain Obvious. Okay. There are really only 3 things you need. I'm going to be one of those guys. If you do these 3 things, you will have open source success. Whoa, right? That's important. We all love that. So what are those secrets to success? And these are the Captain Obvious things I told you. You need a kick-ass project. Seems obvious, right? You need to have something that is really, really key, that meets a need, that people find that is compelling, and it needs to be really solid. Okay? You need to make it easier than the alternatives. There are a lot of projects out there that are awesome. I love them. That technically they are just spectacular, but when you try and implement them, they're so difficult, I just give up, right? And users give up on stuff that is great just because it's so hard to use. And you need to make sure that people know that it exists, right? Those are super, super simple things, but they are very difficult to get wrong. And we're going to talk about each one of these and dive into each one of them. But let's go back to that journey and talk about why those are important, right? So when we look at this journey, that journey from millions of potential users to thousands of potential people who understand that your product even exists, that's the awareness play, okay? That's where awareness comes in. You want people who are out in the ecosystem, who have a need, who are out there exploring, how do I solve this issue? How do I, what sort of cool things are out there? What should I build my next project with? You need to make them aware that you exist and are around. And once you make them aware, then you have to make it easier for them to actually try it out and start to see value in it. The easier that process is, the more people who will actually try it. And then once they have been made aware and they, find it easy to get started and try it out, then the feature set and the awesomeness of your product will then dictate whether they start to rely on it and whether it becomes part of their tech stack in the future. So you have this awareness to easy to kick-ass play. And quite honestly, all of these will span all of the different parts of the journey. They have different emphases, right? Let's be honest. If you don't have the feature sets that's compelling, people who find you, they're not going to even try it. So you're going to need to have some of that out there throughout that whole journey. But think of it like this. When you want more users, then you turn up the feature set, you make the product more compelling, but you also have to make sure that it's easy. Now, there's a cautionary tale here because a lot of people will just say well, I'm just going to focus on the awareness side. But without having the foundation, the product side, you can actually damage your reputation and your project. Okay, a lot of open source companies that I've worked with, a lot of projects that I've worked on, they have this great awareness play. They might have great content, great, awesome DevRel, people out there telling me how awesome this stuff is. And I go and I try it and it's like, wow, this product isn't very deep. This product doesn't meet what I need. And maybe it's hard to install. And once I've invested the time after I get excited about it and I've been disappointed, it's really hard to get me excited about that product again. A lot of users think that way. And so by driving awareness and making, people come into the ecosystem too quickly when the product is not stable, it's not flushed out, it can leave a really bad taste in people's mouth. So you have to make sure that you have a really solid foundation. That doesn't need to mean that it has to be 100% polished, but if it's a beta level product or an alpha level product, you need to hit certain milestones to make sure that people who are coming into the ecosystem find value in it quickly. Otherwise, you're going to have people bounce right away, and you don't want that either. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to tell you, first start with the kick-ass product, then go to the make it easy, then go to the awareness. That's the order that I would focus on first and foremost, but all of them are equally important. So let's talk kick-ass product. So again, without sounding too obvious, we need that really outstanding, awesome product as the foundation for everything else that we're going to do. Now, when we talk about that, I want to start with this mistake that I see often across projects, across the ecosystem, whether you're founding a company, whether you're just a maintainer on a project, whether you're contributing to a project. When people often start open source projects, they're building them for themselves. Okay? And that is awesome that you have this niche that you want to scratch, that you want to solve. And you will oftentimes, early on in your project's lifecycle, build a community around like-minded people. And that is really great. People who have the same experiences with you. But as you start to build your project, that could be limiting, because how many people are actually in your specific shoes? How many people think like you? How many people have the same experiences, the same background as you? And while you can gain initial success with, that really targeted, thought process around, I'm going to build this for other like-minded folks, at a certain point, you hit the limits of what that is. And you're going to start to need to think outside the box and build a more diverse ecosystem, right? There are a lot more people who don't think like you and have the same experiences as you than have those same experiences. So you might be comfortable doing certain things. You might be comfortable installing from source. Other people won't. You might be comfortable only deploying via containers. Other people may not. It's okay to limit your options, but you have to realize that that limits that initial audience size as well. And so that's going to have a limiting factor on adoption. Not necessarily a bad thing. But as you grow the business, you have to start to explore what your audience really wants and what you're trying to do. And all of this starts with a very fundamental question, and that's starting with the question of why, right? So you need to understand why you're doing this project, and you need to understand what this project can do better than anyone else, right? What are you trying to accomplish with this? What sort of things are you looking to do? And if you're trying to commercialize this, you could ask this in a different way. What are people willing to pay for here? Why would people use my software over the alternatives, right? Why are they going to be looking at this over this other thing? I come from the database background. In a database space, there's dozens and dozens and even hundreds of different databases that you could use. So why choose this database that I am building in the open source space? Why choose my project over all the others? And there can be really compelling reasons for that. It could be, I don't use SQL, I use API. The whole NoSQL thing in the back, people built entire companies around that. And that's cool if that is your niche. But realize that as other companies and other projects evolve, your niche might be, gobbled up by someone else. So what makes you unique and why you over the alternative? But ultimately, you have to be comfortable with what you consider successful. If your success is, I want to just use this for my company and get a few other people to contribute, that's different than if you are, I want to build a commercially viable business and have a giant exit and never have to work a day in my life again. Those are two very different outcomes and have two very different, step points. And so what your success criteria is helps color how you build the product in the future and how you focus your efforts. Now, ultimately, this gets back to who are you building this for and who will use this project, okay? If it is DevOps engineers, if it is, Python programmers, if it's, front-end developers, all of those are different demographics. They have different needs and they have different expectations. And so understanding that is critical. In the database space, there are a lot of database companies who aspire to chase engineers, right? Developers, even though a lot of the features and things that they're building are for back-end admins, right? From a front-end developer perspective, oftentimes it's very difficult to capture the attention of that front-end developer with database-specific features, because honestly, front-end developer doesn't really think databases that often. So understand that demographic and who's going to use the product, and if you're trying to commercialize, who would pay for it. And also understand where those users likely are going to be hanging out, right? Not only from a community perspective, but if you are really trying to chase the analytics demographic, that means that, hey, a lot of people are going to use Python. They're going to use R. These are, communities where they're going to have a bigger play. And as you design features and as you design compatibility, which languages you focus on, which partnerships do you explore, which integrations do you explore, where people are hanging out based on that ultimate end user. That's going to help, dictate where you want to focus those efforts, right? And again, if you're commercializing this, where are those potential customers? Ultimately, though, like I said, you're not building this necessarily for yourself. You want to build this for mass appeal, and understanding that audience lets you start to ask questions. And as a maintainer, as a founder, as someone who is critical to a project's success, you need to be able to listen more and ask questions more than tell people what you're going to do. This is a critical, step and a critical component of any product management or project management philosophy or department, right? So as the quote unquote product owner, product manager for this particular product, you need to listen to what your audience says and what they want. And it might be different than what you personally want. And this is why, people fall into that mistake that I mentioned earlier on, right? Your success is only going to be viable with additional users, right? So if your goal, you're here to listen to how to grow open source adoption, so I'm assuming that you want more users, that means that success is predicated on more users. And in order to get more users, you need to listen to their feedback. You need to listen to what they want and how they think, okay? And do not make the assumption that people have those same skill sets and the same thought process and walk through the same journey that you do personally. Now, part of this is being consistent, okay? Especially as you start to see people adopt your software, you are going to get a lot more people coming into the ecosystem. And why it's important up front to outline why your user base, who your user base is and which users you are trying to attract, is because you are going to have users coming into the ecosystem who view your product differently than you do and differently than the community that you're trying to foster. And they're going to come in and they're going to say, hey, you know what? If you change your product to do something completely different, I would totally use it. And you could be really good at it. But does it hit the goal and your vision of success and ultimately what you're trying to accomplish? That ultimate why question. And you need to know when to say no to this. I've had lots of different experiences in my past where people have suggested features that might be cool, but ultimately don't meet the goal we're trying to meet as a company, as a project, as, a community. And that is great. And we can give those other people an outlet to say, hey, you should chase that. You should go explore that. Go ahead, fork the code. That's what's great about open source. Go make that a reality. But from a project roadmap, that's not something that we're see as part of our future right now. Maybe it could change if, you go out there and, get some adoption and, we want to come back and talk about this in the future, but you need to be able to be focused on what your ultimate goals and outcomes are. And that's difficult, especially if you are trying to commercialize your open source software, because you'll get people who come in and they'll offer you money. I would sign a support contract with you. Or how about I give you some consulting business if you implement these features? And you can deviate really quickly, very early on, and you might end up with a product or a project or something in the end that doesn't look like what you ultimately wanted, and you might alienate your users. And that's going to limit your adoption if you are kind of all over the board and you don't meet your critical components. So strive being good at a few things early on as opposed to a lot of things. Don't get pulled into 1,000 different directions, and don't go into weird directions that don't ultimately match where you want to go. Look for, common cause, common purpose in your product design. Now, that gets back to this, there's an expectation, okay? If I am a database project, I'm building a database, there's certain expectations that pop into your head, okay? And this is true with any product you're trying to build. Let's use a non-open source project, right? If you have a cell phone, okay, you're a cell phone manufacturer, and you have the world's best gaming and audio, like file quality cell phones. You can listen to music and you can game, but you can't make calls or you can't send messages with the phone. That is no longer a cell phone. You have not met the purpose of your project or your company, right? So if you set out to build this awesome cell phone and it ends up not being able to make calls or, send messages, that's not a cell phone. So understand, what are the key ingredients? What are the key aspects that your project, your product requires, right? And so that could mean things like, hey, we just need to make sure it does the job that it's intended. If you're a database, you need to store data and be able to access it, retrieve it, change it. If you can't do that, you have no business being called a database. If you're a cell phone and you can't make calls, you have no business being called a cell phone. So you meet those minimum standards, whether that's security, protection for data loss, bug-free as possible. You're always going to have bugs, but, make sure that whatever the expectations from your community, and you should listen to them about what the expectations are for that. That's where that listening comes into critical play. Make sure you have that. Now, next, we want to make sure that we are focused on UIUX. I can tell you that this is a kind of a combination of making it easier for users, but also very critical to product. Products that have a really crappy UI or user experience don't get adopted. And this is probably one of the first hires or the first people that I would seek out, is someone who can help with that user design and that user experience, right? Because if you have awesome software, you have awesome features, but nobody can use them because it's so hard, it's bad. And GitHub's littered with good ideas, but that are impossible to use. And you need to make sure you avoid that. Make it easy for users. Okay. So that gets, you want to make sure you've got that, UI UX down. You want to make sure that you have a really core vision on where you're going to go, and that you're very fervent, that you're meeting the needs of that core business and you're meeting the expectations of the users. You want to understand what users are looking for in your project. And you also want to make sure that you are very purposeful in what you're doing, right? And that leads us to community. Okay. Open source projects all need community. You can't go it alone. If you are a solo maintainer that wants no contributions and you want no community involvement, you're building something for yourself, and that could be cool. But then the question is, what is that success criteria? But you need to make sure, if you are looking for adoption, that you are purposefully planning out the community activities and how you will interact with and engage with your community. But realize that there are examples out there, that, are beyond code. Okay. Look at like, from a community perspective, when you have people who are coming in, we're talking, code contributions, but you look at, an example like curl, there's a lot of examples and tutorials on how to use curl out there. And from your community, what you want is, you want that level. You want people who will contribute code, but you also want people who are going to go out there and foster that community for you and tell people about how awesome you are. Okay. So all things that you need. We're going to get deeper into community in a second. So we'll just bounce through that. So I told you some keys to building a kick-ass product. A lot of it is planning and purposefully thinking through things and listening to your users. But if you do have a kick-ass product, you need to make sure that it is easier than the competition. Otherwise, the competition can win, because easy is probably the number one feature most people look for right now. All right. And, it's something that, a lot of people get wrong. So a few keys and things that we want to talk about from an easy perspective. There are some things that you should consider how your software is used and deployed. Number one, to make things easier, how are people installing this? If you tell people to go install from source, you will limit the number of people who will use your software. Just saying, I'm just telling you the truth, right? Not everyone's going to want to do that. If you're not using, the appropriate package managers, you're going to limit people. If you're not, available on, the different, container registries, you'll limit folks from adopting. right? So think about your installation path, where those users are. If you've asked where your users hang out and you understand how they use your software, you're going to understand how most people are going to install and set up the software. And you're going to want to follow that kind of, uniform path. But you're also going to want to look at how to make it easier out of the box. Same defaults. Database is a classic example of this. There is almost no database that has their configuration set up out of the box to actually work with every sort of workload, right? Means you have to tune it, you have to set it up. How easy do you make it to set it up? And if you don't set it up, if you don't spend the time and effort to configure it, do you have same defaults? And some places, I'm not going to set a default password. Is that sane anymore? Probably not. I'm not going to turn on any security features. You're going to have to turn those on yourself. How you enable people to move from, getting started to being productive in a production environment, that's important. And that gets into automation and things like that. How much can you automate? Can you give people a wizard or a tool to help with configuration out of the box to help them adjust and pick the right parameters or pick the right setup for their environment? How do you, what do you give them in terms of like tooling to automate deployments of this or plug into their CI/CD pipelines? All of those things are things that you need to think through. Of course, the UIUX that I said is important, but also debugging, right? These are things that all projects should think through how they implement, because how easy these are will dictate how often people look at your product and go like, there's easier options. All of these could be, I can't automate this. I can't plug this into, my current pipelines. I'm going to go find something that I can. I can't debug this problem. I'm running into a problem. I don't know where to get the log files. I installed this and it spewed data all over the internet. I'm not going to use that again. Right? These are things that if you get wrong, can cause people to run away from your project or not even look at it. So you want to avoid those. You also want to make it easy to contribute. Okay. And contribute is more than just code. Obviously, code is important for a lot of open source projects, but when we talk about docs, knowledge, and support, these are also really, really critical for us. Okay. And a lot of times, easy starts with good readmes and docs. And this also will get into the awareness play a little bit. But when we talk about, making things easier for end users to actually try the software, their first experience is generally going to be your docs or your README. They're going to go look at how to install or how to use and see if this meets their needs. And if your docs are horrible or your README is non-existent, guess what? They're not going to try your product. It's going to completely limit your adoption. Again, Captain Obvious, but you'd be surprised at how many projects focus on, I'm going to focus on the engineering and I'm going to ignore the docs, right? And, I mentioned that we at Scarf do some analysis and we help, track user-based statistics. And one of the things that kind of hit me is we looked at people who are hitting documentation, how many of those went on to download? And there is a stark difference between those who do well in their docs and those who don't. So, for instance, the best projects that we've seen in the world, they have one download for every 5 people who are browsing docs. The worst have 500 to 1. Why is that? There's actually some commonality between these, right? So what makes good docs? What do those people who are doing good docs do? Well, honestly, the thing that I noticed is they all explain their project in common language. They don't make assumptions on the user base is super technical. They can explain it. And within 10 seconds of going to someone's, doc or the README, I understand what that project can do in common language, and it has me interested to take the next step. It doesn't go into installation right away. The first thing it starts with is, this is why this matters, and here's how it's going to help you, right? Having that up front is super critical. And projects that get docs right do that more, right? It also has visuals. Obviously, README is a little different in some cases, but whether if you're on GitHub or if you have a web page that has docs, having a graphic that shows how the project works, or a diagram of the architecture, or some sort of flow chart, that helps get that visual in 10 seconds or less. I don't know if you knew this, but studies have shown that humans now have the attention of a goldfish, less than 8 seconds. That means that you have 8 seconds to get people interested in your project, and they're going to make a determination whether they want to read more or potentially download within the first 8 seconds of hitting your website. So when you talk about docs, when you talk about README, if that's the entry point, getting that right and getting that right quickly is very important. And you might put a video up, you might put, like I said, the diagram, but ultimately, if you look at your README within 10 seconds, can I understand what the project does and why I should want to read more? You don't need to get everything in there. You just need to get it to the point where in the 8 seconds, my attention has been captured and I want to read more and understand more. That needs to be the first thing right at the top. Okay? Now, once you have that, being able to find the next thing and logically kind of walk them through the journey, that's where it becomes critical. So we're on number 4 here. The navigation and menu has to be easy to use. You need to be able to go from, hey, woo, this is really interesting. I want to know X, Y, or Z and be able to get to X, Y, or Z fairly quickly. If I can't, again, I'm going to start to lose steam and I'm going to go look at other things. Okay? You have to have a mix of actual technically factual documentation and recipes, examples, and tutorials. I'm gonna be honest. I hate classic documentation. I want to know what this can do for me, but then I don't go through most of the classic documentation. I'm looking for an example where I can get started quickly. And that means that I'm going to look for a code example. I'm going to look for a tutorial. I'm going to look for sample code. I'm going to look for something like that. After my first thought process is, boom, okay, yeah, this is something that looks interesting. Now let me see how people actually deploy it. So you have to have those examples, recipes, and other things on that website as well. And you need to make sure that you've covered all of the potential common installation and setup paths, right? So if people are deploying on AWS, do you have an AWS? If they're using Kubernetes, do you have Kubernetes examples and walkthroughs that are separate? Don't put them all on the same page where it is, everything is just like, oh, Kubernetes this and this and this and this and this and this and this. That's one long page, bad user design, bad flow. You don't want that. You want to make sure that you hit specific language sections if you are a library or you are trying to help people with different types of languages, because each audience is going to be different. Somebody who's using Python is very different than someone using Go, and they might have different expectations. You want to optimize each path. And make sure you can provide feedback on each one of the pages, and make sure that your docs are a repo and you encourage people to update and send, changes and fixes if possible. So, this is what I see as a common theme with those who have good docs who actually turn their docs into physical users. So it's something that I would definitely encourage you to take a look at. But ultimately, this is a collaborative effort, okay? You need that solid product, and you need this good content, okay? And you need these to be very choreographed, right? Awesome product, and we're going to show you how to use it. Awesome product, awesome feature, here's how to practically use it. Awesome product, here's why this solves this difficult problem. Here's why you should look at it. And being able to articulate that and show that is super critical. But this then leads into this, I mentioned community here. This is where we now get to this awareness place. So if we have a kick-ass product and we've made sure that it's easy to use, we've made sure that the docs, once you get started, you could follow that process, you can get into it. We need to make sure that people can actually find what we can do, find the things that we've built and start to review it. And this is where community comes in, right? Adoption is really this balance between all of these different groups and all these different functions. But community is typically the driver of adoption. All right. Now, when we talk about community, Devrel, I use this when I talk from a company perspective. Now, if you're a project, you might, you don't have money, so you don't necessarily have specific people for each of these functions, but look at some of the things that are on here. And when we talk about growing awareness, these are plays that you should be thinking about, okay? As a maintainer, as a founder, as a whatever. Are you doing podcasts? Are you talking at meetups? Are you going to conferences? Are you writing any blogs on this? Those are things that will need to be done, Okay. Whether it is someone that is specifically geared towards that or focused on that, or it's just, part of your day job, all of those things are things that need to get done. From a community management speaker, who manages the website, who responds to, questions coming in. If you're going to send out hats or t-shirts or whatever, who sends them out? Who's going to sponsor conferences or, put in for awards or, collect metrics on, is this growing? Somebody needs to do that. Who's going to handle the contributors coming in? Okay. All of these functions that are listed here are things that you should potentially think through. If you're a solo founder, you're going to do all these and you're not going to have time for any of them. But what you're going to find is, as the project grows, okay, as an owner, the time in community increases, and unfortunately, the engineering time generally decreases. And this is where it's challenging for a lot of founders or project owners who get into this to either commercialize or grow the adoption. The more people in the ecosystem, the more that you're going to have to interact with them. And if you don't interact with them, then the user base shrinks as opposed to grows, because people want to have interaction and they want to feel like they're part of something. And so if you are looking for that, probably the most critical thing is to think through your plan. How will you handle community? How are you going to handle this? And I can tell you probably the best way is to find users who are part of your community, to become influencers, to become those community managers, to take ownership of some of these activities. But you want to encourage your community members to become influencers and to become evangelists for your specific product. Right? Because an influencer or an evangelist, they're going to have followers or people who discover their things, and they're going to watch those activities. They're going to read their blogs. They're going to do those things, and then they're going to try what they recommend. So if you have people in the community who are like, this product is so awesome, let me show you how I did it. Remember, I said tutorials are important. That's going to help drive additional people into your ecosystem. And if you're doing that right, those followers, those evangelists, will then turn other people into writing evangelists. And they're going to do blogs, and they're going to propagate this. And they're going to get more people interested in your project. And that's where the community kind of like process really, really works well if you can get this working. You want, to encourage not only yourself or those, in the core development team to do these things. You want to encourage your community and highlight those community things. Make sure on your website, on your, GitHub repo, that you have a list of external articles, tutorials, other things. Make sure you reward them. Make sure you call them out. If you have the funds to do it, send thank you gifts, swag, whatever, the hat, the t-shirt, the sticker, whatever. Seek them out at conferences, thank them, tweet or, post on Mastodon or on LinkedIn, wherever you are, thank you for this article. This is awesome. You guys are awesome. You would be surprised how much just that simple interaction or that simple acknowledgement means to a lot of folks. But let's get back to those docs. Why is this so important? It gets back to how you learn, how you personally learn as an individual or as a developer. Okay. When we talk about those tutorial walkthroughs, videos, blogs, streams, people all learn differently and they approach things with different problems. And so when you talk about your individual activities, when you talk about your docs, you might build your docs a certain way. End users, people in different communities will think about how they consume and how they learn differently. And you can't necessarily cover them all. So having that strong community base who can contribute, not only code, but who can contribute, additional articles, additional walkthroughs, videos, streams, whatever, in different technologies, that's going to really supercharge the environment and lead to that adoption. So what are some popular ways to grow adoption? Well, content, right? We're a content society. The more content we have, the better off we are in a lot of cases. But those tutorials, those examples, if there's news about something that your product can solve, being able to hijack or jump into that discussion and be able to talk about how you solved it, what sort of, things you did differently than other folks, always a good place. Having friends tell friends, that networking is so critical. Good messaging and positioning. So just being able to articulate what your project can do and be able to make sure that people know about it. Testimonials, external evangelism, all these things, right? These lead to additional adoption. Now, we kind of said, hey, there's these three things, right? But how do we track this? So there's a few different ways, right? So if you're tracking awareness, you're going to be looking at GitHub stars, or GitLab likes, website traffic, unique views, engagement, referral, share of voice. Ultimately, the awareness side, you're looking for more people to see your stuff. But ultimately, what you want is more people to use it. And so then you're going to start looking at things like downloads or signups or net new companies or users. Ultimately, I want to see users who started to use it and are still active after 90 days, right? But things like this that we're listing here, these are the things that you would want to track to say, are we seeing the increase in usage? Are the things we're doing actually working? And keep in mind that open source adoption doesn't necessarily mean commercial success. Those are two separate things. Because oftentimes when we talk about the commercial adoption or the commercial success, they're focused on different metrics than the community DevRel folks, right? So we could be happy from a community perspective with additional users, more Slack users, more GitHub stars, whereas the business side is focused on reoccurring revenue or sales. And so these don't always match. So make sure if you are trying to do commercial that you do match these up and you have a plan for both. Because ultimately, when we talk about commercialization, it's a lot of that conversion from free to paid users. So again, if you are looking to do that free to paid users, there's a whole nother section that I could get into. But keep in mind that a lot of the same things you're doing from a community perspective are also going to be in that that space as well. So you'll want to look at different products or policies or different things that would help that drive that. But recapping, ensure you have an awesome product. Make sure it's as easy as possible for folks, and make sure people are aware that you exist. And focus on that content along with features. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you for listening, everybody. And again, Matt Yonkovit. You can reach me at any of these channels if you are so inclined, and would love to chat with you and hear more about what your experience is in this space.